niya ka kwa ba ka wa Pol Pot na tala Pol Pot ne ke par ga le Cambodia a ko ne mi do ma le po ke par ga le pu tho lo ra da je ke ko ke na je ma ti ma wa ra su pa ko ne Pol Pot ne ge ne mi do ma ko ne kwa pya Pol Pot ge ma
The man known to history as Pol Pot was born with the name Salot in the village of Prexpal in northeastern Cambodia.
When a Pol Pot ne ke par ga le o ple ra wa da le Cambodia ko ma le Easter pa ma no le Cambodia ko do ke wa da par ga le o ple ra ne a mi me Pol Pot ba mi me le a mi le salsa no a when ke wa o ple ra wa le to to khu ya ki chi khwe kwa ma no da wa da wa Pol Pot ma no.
At some time in the second half of the 1920s, official records place his birth date as being on the 25th of May 1928, but others have suggested a date of birth over 3 years earlier.
Ako ne da wa da ani la ne wa awala ta ma no ma kha bu le official ya da wa da wa common ne le chi khu da ma no le la mi chi khu da ba sa na ke ne da wa da le no ko ne pa ga da wa da ani ne la ne a thon ne da ba wa wa da ani ne da ba wa ma da wa da ani ba ne ba de ani ka pa ne ma ba de ko pля le to khu ya ki le khwe khwa ma da to ya ki ya na ne ako ne.
On the 19th of May 1925, given the age that we know that Salot began his education, the latter date of 1928 seems more likely. He was known as Salot for over 30 years, and as we will see, the name Pol Pot was a revolutionary pseudonym, which he...
Ako ne kama la buku ne mi le salsa basa le kine ni ta shi la kine ami he para le Pol Pot le kine bata tinya la ma da awara tes ko par ga le ami do ta pla le ko revolutionary ma wala pa pa chara ba khala kama ne pene chak to ha ne mi te da to le ne me chop pa pa la ma da le Cambodia ne ako ne we chop pa pa ne we chai we do ba kwa kama ne we a chai ba ma mi te da to le le ma da we Mexico ba le Cuba ku se ye ma o ma to ye ti che mo ye ma no.
He gradually began using during the 1960s, one of many he later employed, although it was the one by which he was most commonly known. His mother was Sok Nim, a pious Buddhist who had 9 children.
Amone mi le son nem da ke wa amone ke wa para le Buddha bara po da ke wa ba to kha ma no. Da ko ne ko ne ma ba wa ko ne wa mi le sa ye ma no ko ma sa ma I mean.
Of which Sa was the 8th, and his father was Salot Pen, a relatively wealthy farmer.
Da pa ne mi le Salot Pen ma no awa ke wa para le kama ne hi po ko ne ke wa le pho ba ma ke wa le aba kama ba la ko la kha ta de lu ne kama ne o da ji ma o da ha ko ma da ke wa da wa ma ji pho wa ma kama wa ma ma ji pho ma ke ma ji pho ne ma ji mo la pho ma ji ma ji pho la a tu a to ga ye ma.
In the Prexpal region of mixed Khmer and Chinese ethnicity.
Awane kama na pa ne ke ba le ka pra wa da kama da tro ma no tro ka pra.
Both then as now, Prexpal was a very small fishing village on the Sen River, and since Salot Pem owned over 20 acres of rice-growing paddies and a small herd of cattle, he was one of the district's most affluent individuals.
Kama ne wa ha ko no wa ki ka ki chi da bu a kla ye mo ne kama to wa la wa o ne ba me te ma le ba te ya na pa ne kama ne wa le a ko re pya o de be ne du pla la wa na a mo pa ne hi po ka po ne ke pa ga ye la ma kama mi te da pa ga na ye la ma da te ga ya ne ma o da ta su da ga mo ye ma do chi ya ne.
As such, the man who would one day become known as Pol Pot grew up in an affluent upper-middle-class family, an important point to remember when evaluating his later ideologies.
Da wa ne le ki ne ba da te nya la le kama salsa ne le ki ne ba da te nya da po pa da ko le ki ne ba te la ta ko ta ma lo ma do te ba le ki ne ta chumo ma ne ha tha wa da ho ne ko lo tu le ideology ma no.
Any account of Pol Pot's life and career must be understood against the backdrop of Cambodia's wider history, as Cambodia's past had been extremely varied by the time that the Roman Empire was collapsing and the Middle Ages were dawning in Europe.
အခုနေလည်းကမ္ဘောဒီးယားနေဝပပနောကဝဲဒီတော့လေဒီကော်တပိလေလေထောလေပုကွနေဒီတော့ Roman ဖာရလေကိလာ Roman အဘောမှုနေလောပေါ်တော့လေပတဲမတိုင်းလေကဝဲခမနော်ခမအဘောမှုနာကိနေအတလဖွာရလာတော့ပုံစံရင်ပေါ့အဲ့တော့ထောတော်တယ်အဲ့တော့တဲ့
In Southeast Asia, Cambodia belonged to a number of regions, including modern-day Thailand, which had absorbed elements of Indian culture, but which were rooted in Buddhism rather than Hinduism.
အခုနေကမ္ဘောဒီးယားနေကဝတီကော်တပိလေခမမလင်းညာနေအဘောမှုဖာလဲဘာတဲ့ပါတီလေယူကောရင်မှာကနကနေဒီကော်တပိနေဝဲကေဝရရတော့လေ Hindu တဲ့ပါမွတ်စလင်ပါကနကဝကေဝရ Buddhism ဘာသာကတိကောမှာ
In the 9th century, a strong imperial state began to emerge in Cambodia, the Khmer Empire, so named for the Khmer-speaking people of the region. It rose in the centuries that followed to become the most powerful state in Southeast Asia. Its capital of Angkor Wat may eventually have been home to nearly 1 million people in the 12th and 13th centuries. But thereafter, the Khmer Empire declined, and by the 16th and 17th centuries, Cambodia had become a backwater between Siam and Vietnam.
အခုနေတဲဝဲတာလပုကူလာခမကမ္ဘောဒီးယားလပုကူနာဘောမှုနေဖာလဲလောဇန်လခိနေလောပေါ်လေခလောကမ္ဘောဒီးယားနေကဲရရတော့ဗီယက်နာတဲ့ကဲကဝဲယူကောတဲ့ကမနေကမ္ဘောဒီးယားတော့တဲဝဲလာဘောမှုနေလောချိတ်ကေပေါ့နော်
It is not surprising that the kingdom was easily absorbed by the French into their growing colony of French Indochina in 1867.
အဝနေတော့ထောခေါ်ရခုစီနူနေဖိနိချက်တော့နေပတဲ့လခိနေလာချလာလောဝါ fresh တဲ့ဖာနေမလဲကောတော့ဝဲနူလာတော့တဲလေတက်လခိကတဲ့နေဝဲနာကေ fresh တဲ့ဖာနေဟလာပေါ်ဝရပတဲမတာမလို့လဲဟလာမလဲလဲပေါ်ဝရရှိကောဝရကမ္ဘောဒီးယားမှာတော့တဲဝရတယ်မှာဝဲပါဝဲရှိကောတကီခေါ်မှာမင်းမနော်
Although the relatively peaceful transition to colonial rule ensured that the monarchy was kept in place as a puppet government by the French. Thus, the Cambodia which Pol Pot was born into and grew up in was a French protectorate, though.
အခုနေတူလဖဲမတလဖောဖောဖလက်ရစတော့လာနေပတဲမှာလအဝရကမ္ဘောဒီးယားနော်အော်ဒါလ fresh တာဤထွဲကွာထွဲဖောလာကြလားမခမတကဲရတော့ဘောမှုပြီလို့ပါနော်
One in which some benefits had accrued from European dominance, owing to slightly improved standards of living and more secure food supplies. For instance, the Cambodian population more than quadrupled in the 80 or so years after the commencement of French rule, from just under 1 million people to well over 4 million by the middle of the 20th century.
အခုနေတူလနီကဝခိကရဘနလအဝ 20th century နခမနေပတဲမှာတူလနေပါခမတဲ့ဖနာတိဘကောဘွန်ဟဲအာရမဆရာကလဝ French တဲ့ဖာနေပဝရခမတဲ့ဖာလာကပတဲမှာလက်တလက်ထောက်လက်ထောက်အုံးမအဲ့တဲ့
Pol Pot's family enjoyed extensive connections with the Cambodian government, including the royal family, and it was through these that the young Tsar was able to obtain a position as a novice monk at the Buddhist monastery of Wat Bottomwade in the capital Phnom Penh.
I want to come a little talk with Tassiluna, I want to pretend my love for Pahibo Pony, double.d to me, my commodity and thick color that are really out the top, Lepanopend or Lekina, Panopena, Camaria, Wipomona, Lekila, Wadoni, what attack with a leg, Tower, Joe, let's talk at Joe, the Maloa Limon.
1934. Here he learned Buddhist teachings and literature. But perhaps the more significant impact of his time here was his exposure to a system of rigid discipline. Thereafter, he was sent to a Roman Catholic primary school in 1935.
The Lekila, well, taught to a lot of, but Pablo taught to me, where Plala when again, let discipline Papoda, but then now at the toilet, Jula the Capiata, and none at the Lodo Doiva, many we are called Tatora the Hikoda, to Lekilane, but Tela, Tala Shagdaga. Catholic Jomano, the Roman Catholic primary school mono. The Tokuya, Tashi Yen, Koma, Tower, Continental, Tower, Tokajo, the Kilora, Kabula Badela, Tatora, Tokakahora, where Mat Pivara, the Kiloneta Sagadaga, Tokatus Jomano, the Tokuya, Tashi Yen.
This was a colonial establishment where Pol Pot was educated alongside the children of the French colonial community. He was not very academically gifted or inclined, preferring sport instead of his studies.
Ako ne Pol Pot ne ke wala patela amali to bale ko wana at ole wala ki le ko yiwa 那个我给我个了的多早他嘛落了个话呢，我多早了他look吧。
And it was not until 1941 that he graduated from the primary school, 2 years behind schedule. Nevertheless,
I ni lekine wa tho primary school ma na flow la flow na ke ne wa secure kini ma kama de ba flow ba che ba ton ne flow ba na ke ne wa da lekine wa flow ma da wa le finish ka to ha de me le ku we bu kama ne wa pla le kama wa ke wa la ke do ke tho ba ma kama da te ne ma.
His privilege and family ties continued to benefit him, and despite his poor performance hitherto as a student, he was admitted in 1942 to a prestigious new boarding school, which was
But I taught to ma li me ba ba san na ke ne all the poor performance ne ka jo bo ga le ma li ba ba ma na ke ne le ki ne but ma ba kha ba flow primary jo la ne primary နေဘကတဲမှာလဲပြတ်သွားလဲတော့ခက်တာကြိုးပုံစားတယ်မှာနော်ဒီခိလာတော့ဘာအဝဖလိုတော့လာတော့ဘာရှက်ဒါကကြိုးကတော့မှာမဆက်ထောက်ကဒါကကြိုးကတော့မှာနော်ကမနေလဲစရာဘက်တော့ခရရလိစင်းနေမှာနော်
was patronized by the Cambodian monarchy. He would remain there until 1947, again indulging his passion for football and basketball over his studies. Cambodia's politics was shifting dramatically. While Pol Pot was undertaking his education,
အဝဖဲဝကြိုချက်တော့နေတော့ဖဲနေမခပါဒီယာအတီလူကောတဲ့တဲ့ဖာနေချောတဲ့ချလက်တော့အဝအတော်တူညာမမတယ်လားဝါဒီထော့ချိုးပါစနာကင်းတော့ဝါသနာဝဒတာလတာကလုကွဲတော့လဘတ်စကတ်ဘောတဲ့ဖာလဘလဝမှုနုပေါ်တာကလုကွဲတဲ့ဖာမနော်
French colonial rule in Southeast Asia was weakening considerably as a result of the outbreak of the Second World War in Europe in the autumn of 1939.
But then Malata Dolone, they finish on a couple of Tadu Kera, Tadu keep blood blockade out of Europe, Pedu Tokuya, the Sikura, fresh state pan, a tap and a wichagala, come over baki, come on look a quatwera, where Ticola, Power up, them a bombula, Power pan, fresh name, were quatwed near, but Agija Bachara, or Ulama, were going to get our Dutch or the letter color Cambodia common.
Taking advantage of the situation, in October 1940, the neighboring kingdom of Thailand invaded Cambodia and Laos and succeeded in taking possessions of
the Pedro Tokuya, or Nikan quiet. A common looking over there of
of his time here was his exposure to a 18-year-old, whom the French believed would be more pliable than Prince Moniret, Monivong, Cambodian monarchy. He would remain there until 1947, again indulging his passion for football and basketball over his studies. Cambodia's politics was shifting dramatically. While Pol Pot was undertaking his education, French colonial rule in Southeast Asia was weakening considerably as a result of the outbreak of the Second World War in Europe in the autumn of 1939. Taking advantage of the situation, in October 1940,
I want to put a talk quickly. Lucini, you gone and learn like the weather. I would have Cambodia. I would have Matemala, learning like the weather Cambodia, mother, I talk to Kuya Lucy.
The neighboring kingdom of Thailand invaded Cambodia and Laos and succeeded in taking possessions of some border provinces from.
I want to come on you. Nella do whether Cambodia the Lao and the le with the Kuya Lucy and all. Pay Patema do it to Kuya Lucy turn it our money with that. That lot of no more. They were let a lot of no where my name. Our money with that Cambodia that lot our Lao that lot of teacher got your Panama. No, I don't tell you, let do a lot of money.
The French. Then, in April 1941, King Monivong, the puppet monarch of Cambodia, died. He was replaced by the French by King Sihanouk, an
The Lekilane Chopala put up a Dagane, Timor, or Choparana, T, money one at T. The Lekilane fresh near where Patagorale Noroton, Sahanok, Le Kerawa Chopamana, Le Cambodia Conaman, Le Awanitavada, the little Tokuya Kisiki, whether common era that Tokuya Lucita, the little Kokuya Yes Yem or Quirquani.
18-year-old, whom the French believed would be more pliable than Prince Moniret.
I went about a guy named Para Chopa, honey, not my way, or that Chiquanilla, on a French or somewhere what I do, come out chat with the enemy.
Monivong's designated successor, but Sihanouk would prove less of a puppet than was foreseen, and he would play a major role in the tumultuous politics of Cambodia over the next 70 years. No sooner was he on the throne than Cambodia was invaded by the Empire of Japan.
The Kira and Japan are going to hell on whether do whether Cambodia mono. Whether let that keep up Salada, le Euro, Lores Agada, le Isalon, Japan, hello do whether Cambodia mono.
As the Second World War spread across Eastern Asia and the Pacific, Cambodia would suffer 4 years of occupation.
I want to kilometer dollar, Japan hello do whether Cambodia do when kilometer dollar and the power Louis mono whether. Power in me a commota do that, well, Louis mono.
Then, as the end of the war neared in 1945, Sihanouk proclaimed an independent kingdom of Kampuchea in March 1945.
The killer that to keep blood with the other thing, I to keep blood with it. Come to let to keep blood with lucky in Bacaleta Happer, Tia Cota Hamalia Gone, the Patella Tag Pamarpila, Malcolm Kevata Pota Yagon, while Hamalia Coda Colowami, French running, Naki Yaki, Leti Color Marpilla Wagonino, while Pale part of Wello, Welling, a titibly for the blame, not Pennicana Capochane, Keto Tokuya, Lucy Yen, or Bubara like a data blame on. When a Bubara later to live French, come edo, dead all French ball of no. Let that keep blah blah, we let Japan shoe we lucky mother.
It proved short-lived, and French colonial rule was quickly reimposed on Cambodia in October 1945.
Mazana Kene, French in the Hikawana, French in Como Cambodia and Edo Higet, he got at the Blivazna Kene, French near the hill at the Bliva, mine at the land. At the hill at Cambodia, at the Bliva, at a poem, and a set poem.
But this brief experiment in independence foreshadowed the struggle to end colonial rule which was to follow. Pol Pot's path in the years following the Second World War, though, increasingly pushed him away from Cambodia altogether. Having left boarding school without finishing his studies or acquiring his baccalaureate, he enrolled in 1948 in a carpentry.
Come on, a couple of times to Yakone. When talk with Pol Pot and talk with Johnny, but the put up a bachelor degree, come on, a couple of times Yakoda, what the talk to a Obama, what get out up what did up homo, what did what did I get out, what did up with what the carpentry, and come on, what did lot chin, no me, law me, gray me. I want to get her what did up on our touch of the turf. I want to couple of times to Yakona.
Course at the Technical College in Phnom Penh.
I went to college, but not paying a come out of the turf. I call it that Yakoma.
Given his family background, Pol Pot might have been expected to follow a different career path, and setting out on a vocational training as a carpenter would have been viewed as a step down for the son of a wealthy landowner at the time in Cambodia.
Come on, I care about a meal like a child do the water, care about a come on, what to do the clothes, what you and I let talk to water, the top about you, and talk to water, market, but get out what the tapo or come on what the lodging or what team that in our lot, what I want. Come on, plala, tobacco, monetary.
Yet it seems that his privilege once again benefited him in the months ahead, as Pol Pot's academic shortcomings were ignored, and in 1949 he was awarded a prestigious scholarship to attend an advanced engineering school far away in Paris in Europe, the capital of the French colonials.
According to Kid, over penny, where come on, but where when talk to the moon, and I get let up time and a cookie, the kid over here, water color, let talk about the French mono, when I look at my low down the French mono.
At the time, it was not uncommon for the French to invite the sons of well-connected colonial families to acquire their education in France itself, the goal being to inculcate young men like Pol Pot to the virtues of French society. And
according to checked up in French, two not job while la chorda ya le kwa le po de pa ne do ga ke ko le ti ko ro ka la ma lo li ne to na jo na ga ne le ta la chorda kha le kha mo ba khu tho da Pol Pot ne pa le wa kla ne wa ne ke ba ga le common French ka ti we le ba ga ba ye tu wa ti wa kha kha ga chomo one da ya ta kwa ya le ka ma lo le ma lo li le French mo
encourage them to want to maintain French control over countries like Cambodia rather than seeking independence. Thus it was that Pol Pot set out for Paris in 1949.
fresh ပဲသွားနေချုံမရပေါ်ကရဗမေသို့လို့ရဗမေကကောလ fresh တော့ဟေတာကောကိုတေလာရီတော့လေကမောကဝဲကောလာမအဲ့ချုံမရလို့ပေါ်ကရကလောကတီတပြေကောတပြေကကီလေကချကောကကီလေခိုကမ်ဘောဒီယာတော့ကလက်ဆောကလောတီတပြေကောတပြေပါမနော်အဝနေဖေတော့ထုတ်ခုရလူစီခွီတော့ဝနေဝဲလက်ထောက်ဝဲကျလ fresh လာမနော်
However, the political climate of Cambodia in the post-war period was such that Pol Pot would become radicalized against French colonial rule while in Europe, rather than inculcated into becoming a supporter of the French presence in Indochina.
那个呢，不得了，你到 French 他出门那个嘛的喂，把个呢，对了喂，他就 keep 不了位了呢，喂呢，该把个了，这出去的啊，看嘛的，到了 French 他不得不跑了吧，到了，个到给了把了，这 blame 嘛，那个呢，喂，他到了 French 嘛，那个。
Before examining Pol Pot's time in Europe, we need to look at events in Cambodia itself in the late 1940s and early 1950s, in the aftermath of the Second World War. King Sihanouk had succeeded in gaining some concessions from the French government to grant greater autonomy to Cambodia. The country's first elections to a domestic parliament were held in 1946.
Di talo pa Cambodia the one edo magni ta the French or French the hiba masana ne French ne edo te da le common wada ka se per wada do khisi ko na hi ada ta khwada ya le ka ke wa autonomy the kama common hi ada ta khwada ya ane di le no wada le French ta pra phola lo common ada ta khwada ya do chi ere mo da.
And a new, modern constitution for the country came into effect in May 1947. Negotiations continued in the years ahead.
When they got a time, I would actually got up the Sakoti card, do whatever the autonomy knocks at up all of that. Man, the liquid of the what death go well, come up a leg, what it be called, and say a local quilla. They got a French got it too low in a mono, and they were another shot the leather, not fresh and here are attack with a yet, the jebo animal.
For Cambodia to be given a more concerted form of independence, and thereafter, this was driven by events elsewhere in Indochina, as, since December 1946, the French had been fighting a war in neighboring Vietnam against insurgents who wished to acquire independence from French Indochina.
Fresh ne, we have Powerdani, but Bana Poletala fresh now, we have Powerdani, Powera Vienna, Powera Gigi, loud, Power Yonino. Nagane, Peta to keep la we lucky, but $1 all but one moon go at top of that Pola on a well that the bill. Le Vienna Nagane, get up, Chora, Hill, to be called the bill fresh original. Come on in the Le Awada, Cambodia, and Maoyan Gilamo, that animal, come on. Finish up done it, tell French or Backwatchman, Acton, Vienna with the penny, which had a Pochorani, the weather French name, Mawa Chuchu.
The First Indochina War would drag on eventually until 1954 and would extend into neighboring Laos and Cambodia. It was the beginning of a long period in which events in Vietnam substantially impacted on developments in Cambodia. And for the meantime, the insurgency in Vietnam made the French government more willing to grant concessions to King Sihanouk and Cambodia as a means of shoring up support there and avoiding another independence war. Yet the concessions which Sihanouk continued to obtain in the late 1940s were viewed as not going far enough, and so as Cambodia entered into the early 1950s, the country was rife with political instability as many parties emerged, calling for independence and an end to French colonial rule.
The one, but they lucky to learn it, what Hidage, Quaticane, Hida, Kamane, but they what Gadulama, who TW got the bleeding. Masalekini, what Aran, who TW got the bleeding, and all fresh type product, Palavado, or that French Nagin, or Devil Chopper, senior Nagan, Mat Quadra, come on, a work clear, that would have like a separate moment in Nagano, but Cambodia, Cambodia, Capuchadin money.
With some also wishing for the abolition of the monarchy, which was tainted by its long associations with the French.
The mad of TV because being a not cheat of fresh more, but I will load out TV because the Cambodia, but a TV.
This was the situation at home as Pol Pot arrived in Paris in 1949.
the but then mala papa le ta we to le fresh do le to ku ya lu chi ku ne we get to we la ka cha ko ma le Cambodia mo no.
The stormy politics of Cambodia had been transplanted to the French capital. While he lived on the banks of the Seine in the months that followed, Pol Pot became associated with numerous political groups that had been organized by his fellow Cambodians in Paris. One of these was the Khmer Student Association, which met regularly and was broadly committed to achieving Cambodian independence from French rule.
အခုနေ friend ဝရ Pol Pot နေလောဝလေထောက်ကျော်လို့ French တော့နေကဲပေါ်ကလည်းအဲ့တော့ကတီတလေကောတယ်လေတဲ့အဲ့တော့ဦးလေ French တာပေါ်တာ proper လာပါတော့ဝလေထောက်ဖဲဦးရလေ French တော့ဟာနေဦးရတာကွာတဲ့ဖာလေအဖို့တဲ့ကွာတာတော့ ro pro တာလေဒီတော့လေကမနေကတီတလေကောတယ်လေကနေကဘာမှာဝကြလဲမနော်ဝနေမခုသူ့ဝမော်ရတာမဝလေတခုသူ့ဘူးလေကောလေ illegal လေခမမခုသူ့ကိုလေဝလာမနော်
More extreme and effectively illegal was the Cercle Marxiste, or Marxist Circle, a Marxist-Leninist organization which met in secret to read Marxist, Leninist, and other communist writings and to discuss Cambodia's struggle against French oppression.
အခုနေလတာကဘာခေါနေဝဖာဝရ Marxist မြေလေ Leninist မြေမနော်အတချုံမချုံပါသေးတော့ဘာခေါခေါနေခမနေ no plan နေငကဘာထဲတော့တူတော့ငကဘာခမနေတာလေ community လာချုံမနေဘာထဲတော့တူတော့ဘာကဲတော့နေဘာပေါ်ဝဖော့ပါခမနေ equality မအဲဝတိတက်တော့ equality ကိုနေဝရ France နဲ့တယ်ဘာ French ဖိုင်တဲ့ကလေပေါ်ဝရဘာ Cambodia ဘာကပူချပါ fresh နေကဘာကဲလေကကြကောလောခမနေဝว่าคำว่าเดียวกันก็บักจักบักเปิลแต่ละคำว่าเนี่ยถ้าชมมาที่พันเนี่ยที่มาโลนี่ไว้ได้หมดนอกจากนี้เฟรชก็เนี่ยพี่เนี่ยค่ะเนี่ยว่าที่คุยเรื่องมาโลก็ได้ที่พัน
It is important to remember that the great majority of anti-colonial independence struggles in Africa and Asia in the post-Second World War period adopted one form of communism or another as their ideological base in their independence struggles.
အခုเนี่ยพี่เนี่ยချက်တော့ဟာเนี่ยคำว่าเนี่ยเอาไว้ได้ว่าเกลว่าที่เบก็ที่เบนี่ดอดูแล้วคลานเนี่ยเกลว่าเลยคำว่าแต่ดอว่าเลยคลว่าตาปตาปราพอลาวคำว่าเนี่ยดีต่อเลยกันนี่ที่เบก็ที่เบก็เนี่ยนอนที่เนี่ยว่าคำนี้ถ้าชมมาที่ผ้าดอว่าได้ให้เก็บเบอร์เราไว้ได้มาให้เก็บจ่อไว้ได้มาคำว่าดีต่อแล้วก็มันนี่ว่าที่เบก็ที่เนี่ยว่าถ้าชมมาดีเนี่ยเดี๋ยวคำว่าเนี่ยตัวได้ตัวเลย equality ถ้าต่อแค่ต่อตีสองมาคำว่าพอยพากันย้อนนี่ตะกาตะลบเปอร์แล้วแต่ว่าก็บิดลบเปอร์แล้วแต่ว่าถ้าที่ผ้าเนี่ยว่าตัวได้มาคำว่าเนี่ยตัวได้ยัง
Not least because the best way to throw off European imperial rule was by obtaining financial and material aid from communist Russia or China. But in assessing Pol Pot's ideology and future career, we can largely dismiss any ardent affection for Marxist thought.
那看呢，跑跑呢，为了嘛，老了为了看嘛是，他出嘛了，打才多多，打才太多多，看嘛打才不打太多呢，了嘛老呢，你去了呢，他给教为了个家搞了呢，我做了呢，到底早了呢，但呢吵得来了么了，对不对？
Which he might have claimed to have had, as in reality, the future dictator did not really understand Marxist thought at all. What little of Karl Marx's own writings he had read, he later admitted he had not been really able to comprehend. Rather, Pol Pot was attracted by the idea of continuous revolution, without
အခါမှလည်းပေါ်ပေါ်လည်းကိနေဝတ်တဲပါမောခမတလာမလောရမတ်ကာလမတ်စတာချုံချုံရတယ်တမီလည်းနာပခလပါမဆနာကိနေဝတ်တမလောမတော်လေးတော့လေခမတာအတပွချောနေကချူတော့ကောမှာအဲ့တဲတာနိတာချုံကမတော်လေကိလောနေလေကိလောနေပတဲတော့လည်းမခါလအတပွချောလေကိနေလေတီကူရလေတမတီမဝသေးပါကဲတော့ကလေတာတူတပေါ်သေးဖာမဝနေဝတ်ချုံမောပါတဲ့ပါ
concerns for the violence and humanitarian implications of it, which had become a feature of Marxist-Leninist thought in the post-war period. This unswerving commitment to acquiring independence and carrying out a revolution at all costs became the central focus of his political leanings later on, not any ideological commitment to communism.
那今年那个呢，我打出门呢，这没那个来communist 啊，打出门呢，莫管呢，没那个，干嘛那个我提的别搞的别了嘛，干嘛那个土票的我那个 fresh 啊，打不打跑来了嘛，我打出门。
Pol Pot spent 3 years in Paris, becoming more and more embroiled in politics there. His departure from the French capital would eventually come about owing to developments back in his homeland. in January 1953 as the political situation in Cambodia lurched from crisis to crisis.
I want to let talk here. Yes, you turn a pulse in a way. I kick it out. Awada, Hagi, Awada, Temala. Hagi, our Cambodia, the Cambodia corner, but then my child dog in a cane, Macale chop back and shock me. Da Pennicane, but then my but the Sarah too low of them. Come on, Sarah thought Dawada chop.
King Sihanouk disbanded the National Assembly and began ruling by decree. Domestic political turmoil increased rapidly thereafter, such that by the spring of 1950,
when come on the chop again, away come on Sarah to that on a chura. Come on, to low what too low now when I Sarah mother, what to Machura Datura thought, but the Leki turning. Tiru got there, Tabi Butcher, they one had Chura Guyilla.
1953, Cambodia was virtually in a state of civil war. Already in late 1952, the Cercle Marxiste in Paris had determined to send one of their members back to Cambodia to assess the situation on the ground.
According to Lucky Lane, but Jadalum quite in a pop our French now were older part, the pilot come on, like money, whether typically got a bit of French or Lucky Lada, but they're Lekine, Le French, Le Cambodian, and Bagel, relatively got the Bene, out of Lane, Tautan, Hena, Nala, but to let that do, that get him on Tila Governor come up, allow who a job to do, or allow who a job to do. The Lekilano Pala, all the French got their panel, they were putting money, show up what I let take it quite to where that Tawata Cambodia come.
In order to determine which of the competing entities they should be supporting, and so it was that Pol Pot found himself returning to Southeast Asia in December 1952, after 3 years in France.
I went upon it, whether French gone 30, we lucky lot when had to get out whether French, Cambodia, or let Tokuya Yachiki. I went not on it, Tokuya Yachiki, when I tell her, I went a while, Mukoi tell her while the Tagra roller. Fresh got it was sure and was sure up Paula, Kaki Quagata.
As a result, he was back in Cambodia to witness King Sihanouk's call for independence from France in the summer of 1953.
The Wakin again, with Tivada French, whether Kinshin on again, where Edo like the Bilaga, Kamaniga, TB got to be the French or what's it called? The Tokuya Yashitan.
A request which was granted by the French government in November, when it realized that it lacked the support or the military capacity to maintain its control over Cambodia. Independence had been achieved, but it remained to be seen exactly what kind of state would emerge in the new Cambodia.
According to Lucky, fresh in a Tivada, Cambodia, they get here, got out to daughter, come on, well, like a church, my Joe, Lord, control it near Lucky, the better Tokuya Yashitan, but them fresh in too long, whether okay, Mila got out the blade to market, to burger, but not any. Fresh on it, come on, while I could have the blue one, come on, tea collar, go through that being, can be the Cavatilla got delayed the glue money. Tala Tila Chet or whatever.
The next 15 years in Cambodia were a period of almost continual turmoil, which eventually, in 1968, would result in the outbreak of a civil war.
I went a battle, looking at Tokuya Yashi 30, freshness, and up at you call it Mahuda Dodo, Pama, while according the Padella Ticone, Kevin the Brivas and again, Takuda pot over, common at your pa, the Pudi Puila, the Lani, let the Tokuya Huzikon when it get out that you die, Padola, then still a cop that you die.
It was the result of the unrest which continued to dominate Southeast Asia in the 1950s and 1960s.
I wanted to talk to Yachi, the Tokuchina, when Cambodia and Kavati called Bella, Tilakom, Taditaya, Doctor, Southeast Salmon. When it Kavati called Bella, Talavatakla, Watamati, my ward or daughter.
Although the Geneva Conference of 1954 succeeded in ending the First Indochina War between the French and pro-independence Vietnamese, conflict in Southeast Asia was in no way brought to an end. Henceforth, the northern parts of Vietnam became the independent country of North Vietnam, which was pro-communist, while the south of the country also gained independence as the pro-Western Republic of
Vietnam. Lucky Lana, legend, but our poor in the Chatte, where I am going, and need kind of type down little matter quite the I will Chatte, Leta, Bacaleta, but your cota, my laconic of together. But do that, come to say my order. Penny love Vienna and what I key card a southern north need all. get our tika kibine tika the blake kibine where be all the French that were all the French to do on a get up pro communist la where all the east to do what we get out of America in the democracy come on tika and get out of the blue keep it
Vietnam. However, no sooner had the dust settled on the Geneva Conference than North Vietnam began efforts to unite the country under communist rule. Thus, in 1955, the Second Indochina War, or what is more commonly known as
I want to the community. Come on, Tico, and get keep him of Vienna and get our Tico keep it on the Miquality or that's on the top of America. Or that French are calling or looking while I can French while up Vienna, let up while the French do her in a way. Come on, till the negative because of Vienna at all. Come on, go Vienna, they on at all. Papa, Tico to be common. The community. Tapa tapa pola yani mana tera pene pere toku ya yesi yani le pene tadu ta yani kikera kada mo tadu ta ya kikera kada kama so bi awana Vienna na tadu kera mo no.
The Vietnam War erupted. It would last for 20 years, with the South backed primarily.
Awana Vienna tadu ni jiwa ni kichi no wale South Korea wana memele United States wana wa church wa democracy that all the community power kono church wa South Korea tadu ni jiwa ni kichi mo no.
By the United States of America, as French influence in Southeast Asia waned, and the North backed by Soviet Russia and Communist China.
I want to be not about when a water Russia, China, and a community.
Throughout its entire duration, Cambodia was caught up in the conflict, primarily because the North Vietnamese troops, known as the Viet Cong, used Cambodia as a staging base for attacks into South Vietnam, with Vietnamese camps established in the jungles of northern and eastern Cambodia. But as we will see, Cambodia was also increasingly tied up with the North Vietnamese, because radical Marxist-Leninist revolutionaries within Cambodia, such as Pol Pot, sought North Vietnamese aid to foment their own rebellion in Cambodia.
I'm making this quick video because it has been 1 month since joining the Cash Flow 101 system, and so what
Pol Pot's path would soon collide with the North Vietnamese, but for now,
come on, Pol Pot, come on, what you attack with a color where Nagani a Todawa, Banapole, Cambodia, go lucky if any job up, but I am. Pol Pot, where ideology have come over the 2 lower that job, I don't know. No, to me, by America, no, whatever, South Northern, whatever Vietnamese do that check on it. Pol Pot, 2 attack with a color. When I'm going to bus a lot, butcher with a job, like Jatila Gobo, Bosayan Mono. I want to give a duck with a yellow pawpaw worker, Pina what you Mono.
In the post-independence period in Cambodia during the 1950s, he became involved in efforts to effect change through political participation. The first post-independence elections in the country were held in 1955. It was widely believed that the anti-monarchy Democratic Party would win these. And
job by Burden or 2 law, I want to pawpaw and palo or gliding. I don't tell the job by it. The 2 law, I want to. I went out in a pawpaw and one new I got a Democrat Party. I could rub it all. But 2 more I got a good one. You can know. Only what Dr. Man or that. But then my little pawpaw and buy them.
And Pol Pot and his fellow Marxist-Leninist Cambodians now attempted to infiltrate the Democratic Party as a means of exercising influence from within the government, which it was assumed would soon come to power. However, the king had other ideas. With the elections imminent, Sihanouk quickly abdicated in favor of his father Norodom, and then Sihanouk established his own political party called Sangkum Ria Neom, meaning the community of the common people, and in the election, through widespread voter intimidation and fraud, Sangkum won over 80% of the vote, effectively establishing a
when pawpaw and Chumwa and new Democratic Party, you can know, Nagala job power in the thing about the child. Job pan and do what a party to do, you know. Do what a party la Patemala, La Takuto and Mahone, Kevata Takabli, Takabla, Tamatima, one of the old Doduna, while party or a party, Lekilone, but ta Lekitella. but then my sin nog a party in Nella, top a party in Nella. The Pol Pot party in Chulama, but then I do learn.
A one-party dictatorship, with Sihanouk serving as prime minister. As a consequence of the manner in which independent
The Tula Sino party in the Lana, where Kera one party dictatorship, Kera that person come out at all. Come out job by that Chomona headed the letter by about Pura Lotoila. They love the other party leader and what get out one party sister, Posan party leg, I don't know what the two law when they get out of a quality dictatorship, come out party, my show Roma, Danny, the other point.
quickly gave way to conservative dictatorship headed by the former king. Pol Pot spent the next few years in a kind of political wilderness. He continued to be active within Marxist-Leninist circles in Cambodia, but these had largely been driven underground by Sihanouk's seizure of power. And for the time being,
a common Diala, Dumesino, the other party live on a common. Whether party la shoot at the panel, but then my lucky learn the order that thought that all loop power while I thought down in it. I want to finish check down a pop on it, but they over the boo along a mallet jewel guapulama. I want a papa their party or quality democratic party for it.
A concerted armed struggle by either the Communists or the Democratic Party seemed elusive. Meanwhile, Pol Pot acquired a job teaching history, geography, and literature at a private school in Phnom Penh, and in 1956 he married Q Bonnery.
How come on a pop on a common letter code to Bassan again, where come on at the mood colobana when again all upon a penny with what through the web when I who get all on it who were flower la wekera, away Tamaroa, come on party shooting lot away, Tamaroa lot away, or a Panopera, why a mother Joda, with Toria Taragama, the weather testing while the kid away, tea without new without a matter. I would have my mille campondering, no? When I applaud that anymore, little Tokuya Yachiku, no, Papon.
Political oppression continued throughout these years, with senior members of the Democratic Party being subjected to public humiliation and physical attacks during a supposedly official debate in August 1957. However, by the end of the decade, resistance to Sihanouk's dictatorship was greatly diminished, and then things started to change.
Massa Lekine, the Yoga, but then my love, Sino party, our dictatorship party. Tao that child level them a la Risa Basara Honida, Flower Democrat party. Come on, had 2 again.
In 1959, members of the Marxist-Leninist Cambodian movement established the Kampuchean Labour Party, the forerunner of what would later become the infamous Khmer Rouge. In late September, 21 senior members of the party, including Pol Pot, met in a room of a railway station in Phnom Penh, where they agreed to rename the party as the Workers' Party of Kampuchea.
Democratic Party. Awada, Patella, Taradak, Loda, Patella, they were boy here, come on, or put a death go, Talota, that Lemu Clerk, Lekina, where come on, our child leg party, Democratic Party, meaning child leg Worker Party, a Capuchama, no? When a Pol Pot and Power, what Doctor make la Venizilla.
And party positions were allocated. Tu Samot was made General Secretary, while his ally Nuon Chea was appointed as his deputy. But Pol Pot was elected to the bureau and was effectively third in command of the new Revolutionary Party.
I want to penny, Peta Butcher Donny, what child level Kunara, Pol Pot get out what third gamma. A common le party, le party of Buna, what do the third gamma, that they were.
He would not have to wait long before he ascended to a position of leadership when Tu Samot was killed by the Cambodian government.
The leader them go like come party kick party in a senior party the awada but then not burn on a senior party the Pol Pot party in the Galada or a Likida but then Malaysia awada senior like party co when it all Likine Matamati.
Less than 2 years later, Pol Pot would be elected as his successor, and as the second in command, Nuon Chea decided to step back from the revolutionary struggle. But Samot's death was also part of a wider crackdown on the socialist movement in Cambodia. And
the Likida and Matai, the Lothilan or Parague, awara Pol Pot lekila ne wala ke wa tholok ke ki lekila ne semona ke ne beta lekila ne wada do ma khuda la bara o ke le talok ki do pe pe tak do la pu le lo ne khoblo le ta du ta ya ta yi lo wa lo ho do lekini Pol Pot ne ke da ke le party ko ma beta ne ma no.
Even before Pol Pot had officially been appointed as the new head of the Workers' Party, he was forced to flee with his wife to a Viet Cong encampment near the border between Cambodia and South Vietnam. It was the beginning of the drift towards civil war and the horrors that followed in its aftermath in Cambodia. Pol Pot spent the next half a decade largely living in encampments in the jungles of Cambodia and Vietnam.
Akhone bata la lo sino party ne khamo ke wada party ki party ne tai lo wa lo no o ta gu na ta so da ko ma no o le le bata ma le ki lo ne Pol party ko na de pha no ta lu ma ti ma wo ho lo do le ki lo Pol ne o le we bu lo ba ma ha da ko le we clear do ba le o le pwa bu le Vietnam de wada Cambodia culture le pwa bu yen mo do da blue ni de blue lion la ko wada ni.
His personality as a dictator was formed during these years. He was a somewhat enigmatic character, one who displayed a large level of self-control and was reserved and introspective.
Awone Pol ne ke wa la pu ne ke wa la na lo khamo no o da pa nya le chomo da tu khamo ne ke wa la o da character la ge la ma ba ne tu wa le o le pwa bu lo ne ye la ne awone a lu la ke bo da chomo ba ne cho de le ge da ro le ki la ne ta ne he o ge de da le ma so ro ma no ma so ro ta so da a sa de pa ne he nu lo wa da.
Nevertheless, despite his taciturn character and the deplorable nature of his later crimes, many are agreed that he could be charming when a situation necessitated him to be so, while his varied upbringing and middle years had seen him develop an ability to interact with people from many walks of life.
Awa me ke war gale le masoro mo la ta wa sana ke ne ba khala ta ri ti ri ko pa ko ne wa ne a ta pla da ne wi lo mo da ka mo ne ke war gale mu na cha ta po da te da ne lo yu yo pa ke lo mo da te yan.
Behind the apparently amiable facade lay an individual with a great thirst for power, a propensity for savage violence, and a personality that was increasingly paranoid. None of this was alleviated in any fashion by his personal circumstances. His wife suffered from deteriorating mental health in the 1960s, which would descend into chronic schizophrenia in the 1970s.
Ne le ki ne ba te ma la ka yo ne wa ne ka mo ne le ta na ta pho ta tu ta na ta pho ko ne ma na ke ne ba tu ba si ko ta ju ta cha pe de tho ko ya nu chi ne ka mo ne a ka mo ne ta o mu le ta mu ta khu do ba de wa ko wa ne ma tu ga da lo he ta la ta tu ye ni ta ye ni ta na ta pho ye ne da te.
Pol Pot and she would eventually divorce in 1979, and although he remarried later in life, he never enjoyed much of a family life, having just one child, a daughter who was born in the mid-1980s, when he was in his late 50s.
Come on, ta wa ta ba ko ro de hip hop po na ne ta ke ko ro le ki lo de ma la de wa la ma la phlo da la pu ku ga ne do lo pha we do come on ma ke li lo pha do pho wa de ga mo no na ke ne la ta mu pu de de ma la a o ba da hip hop mu ku ku no o ba.
Equally, he suffered from very poor health throughout his adult life, with insomnia and intestinal ailments, conditions which would have done nothing beneficial to stabilize an already erratic personality. Above all, if we are to seek to discover who Pol Pot was and what motivated him, we must remember that he was an ardent Cambodian nationalist and one whose tendencies in this regard.
A ko ne do Pol Pot ne de ma la ta wa ta na ta pho da ko da ke ne ke pa da la ba tu da na de ji la a ko ne ga mi ne ba ti da le de wa la come on ne ta le Pol Pot ne ke wa la nationalist ta le nationalist ne ke wa pa la lo ko ti ko e ke lu ta e ke lu pho ma ko ne pe mi ma lo we le ta si da so ti ko le o phe da wa da le ta de ki bla bla we lo ki ba la ge lo ge ma ne ke ti de ko de wa ne wa ne mi da nationalist la ke wa le sa e ke lu de pa ne do ta bli da ge do ge lo da wa ne ba ko le nationalist khala la no a ko ne Pol Pot na ge na wa ke wa ga la ke nationalist la.
Were heightened in the 1960s as he built up opposition to Sihanouk's regime in the wayward north and east of the country. And if there is any consistency to his actions, It is surely found in his zealous desire for Cambodian independence from French rule and the monarchy epitomized by Sihanouk. As well as being formative in his personal development, these years in the jungle were a time of growth for the Cambodian communist movement, as Sihanouk's repressive regime gained more and more enemies. More revolutionaries fled from civil society into the jungles to plot revolution. Here, they found a new umbrella organization for their resentment. The Workers' Party renamed itself in 1966 as the Communist Party of Cambodia.
Common Lekila and Alasino party Nagan Borani Bella Pala are the two law, they part of Luma Thima war Ara Lon Bella, Paula Kubu Webu Nagan, the two law on the Lekine, but Hoda was Sarah Hawada, come out that Yatilo Kobata Dayan Aramo. A horn or Lekilane was Sarah Hara or Lekilane, while Latila that Pol Pot there Puella and Pilane, come on like a party, blue party like Lana Pola that. But put a lot on a call, whether the community party or Capuchama, no? I want to let the talk with Yakuzikuna, when the Mikualam gone at the Rakama, Papa, the Cha party, called the Liberal Party, my Worker Party, Mano. Masan to me, a party lega, Papola, the lottery, Tatila, but law, Lord, come on, what two law gave a common signal dictatorship when a party dictatorship when a single party does dictatorship when it do it near order. Lekin ay Papola that shot the Lega Miller Community Party, Mano. Peter Tokuya, yes, Dr. Kuyak is cool.
Yeah, but to the southwest in Phnom Penh, Sihanouk had begun referring to the party's members as the Khmer Rouge, meaning red Cambodians. And although Pol Pot and his followers initially rejected the term themselves, it quickly gained traction and is the name most typically used for the Communist Party of Cambodia today, a byword for the terror which would occur years later when Pol Pot came to power. But beyond this name change, the party was also evolving in new ways. During the mid-1960s, first and foremost, it was developing its own independent streak, wishing to break away from the North Vietnamese. Secondly, it had set out on a new ideological course, one which appreciated that the vast majority of Cambodians were actually farmers. As a result, any Marxist-Leninist revolution in Cambodia would not be driven by an urban proletariat such as Marx had envisaged 100 years earlier, and which had occurred to some extent in Russia in 1917. Rather, the undeveloped state of the Cambodian economy dictated that this would be a revolution of the rural peasantry in Cambodia, so much of which had been impoverished by French colonial rule, and that of the collaborationist monarchy, the continuation of which was epitomized in the form of the former king and current dictator Sihanouk. Finally, the major factor at play in these years was the growth of the party and its military capabilities. By 1967, it had several thousand members who were armed in the jungles of northern and eastern Cambodia.
I want to let the Tokuya Husinune, but then my Papa party that was seated upon the Aramano. Arahola, or the Tasugu, where they pala with the Pamano. I want to work a common opinion. Or Tasugu lag, they pala Sara, when away the weather sino party loving no.
Waiting to take action against Sihanouk's one-party state, they struck in the first days of 1968.
No, but then my opinion shut down when it started that let you look up that day. La Buquine, come on, that do that, Mona, what is it to Moya, the Lupa, Lujola, the Luma, Cotula. I work a care lot of the miller when not do ya do loving. Come on, I want to give about Cabu, Chavo, Degdela, Covola, Tachumocho money, the Dithoa, come on, the other Pol Pot, I want to do low at our one party sister, Jadala, our senior party details in the two law, what a two law on the winner. The Pinyane Tadu in Sarali one. Dr. Hukia Huzi called when the Tadu Sarali began.
It was the start of a long and bloody 8-year civil war.
The Tadu, they were Jigura Cornilla, common about Dodula. When a Wakabu Chagda, the other party, the party. But me tell them chatting in Yaga, let the PDF do the weather, me or like a came or done in the Ponsa Yanamana. I want to weather. La Pukuya, the Kaleva Ponsa Chime or done a Yihuanima.
The Cambodian Civil War was initiated in January 1968 when Pol Pot's insurgents attacked an army base at Bai Damran, south of Battambang, the regional capital of northwest Cambodia. Sihanouk's initial reaction to this limited insurrection backfired. He ordered a violent crackdown, with widespread bombing of the north and east of the country, indiscriminate attacks which were designed to hit at communist encampments, but which largely succeeded in alienating hundreds of thousands of rural Cambodians whose livelihoods were damaged by the scorched earth tactics favored by the government in Phnom Penh.
The Patema la sino order to me while the color thing out of put all around the pane. Sino whether Pol Pot the Persino la Puala Clavido. To rag about you let Jugla whether Tyler let Pulla pound the father. Or whether Puacla the father. And not Corona where Edo Telecom whether Pura Loda whether Pol Pop and Le Pia. Naga Tilla my alone about the work of Mula the pa. Or whether the tackler the pa, Dalla tackler tapioma all on it. Whether a common bad do what you got within Pam, but what you were planner, but you got for all a week look over them. I look at Jacob look like any what planner to check without doing flying.
Consequently, support for the revolt, of which Pol Pot was increasingly the undisputed leader, swelled in the late 1960s.
No, but me tell to learn to me. Sino party in Marina, one in the Pala, or who will I see no, they find it 2 lots in all. Come on, Likilana, Plala, who would I pop on.
He was now also increasingly referring to himself as Pol Pot rather than Sa, and it is from this time that the Cambodian Communist
Patema, Sarapin, lucky to deliver Saratulo, Ara running. No, when they were article that Sasa, when it's Saracola, that I mean, Pol Pot, no? Whether Sawa San, whether Pop on Saraco, I mean, what 2 lower call out, I mean, Pol Pot.
leader became primarily known by his pseudonym. In 1970, the Civil War took a dramatic turn, owing to Cambodia's ongoing role in the Vietnam War to the east. In the spring of 1969, the President of the United States, Richard Nixon, ordered a series of bombing raids into Cambodia to try to interrupt the Viet Cong supply lines into South Vietnam and hit at Viet Cong camps and bases in the jungles of northeast Cambodia.
No, but thing I learned to do, what a key carbon. Love Vienna, America, the weather. Whether North America, North Vietnam, so whatever you go to do them or what do that. The look Cambodia, when it about in it, but Cambodia, they would do that. The party, Dagi, when it come on, whether seen no one, I don't put out to let papa on it, the 2 law, and come on it. That do that, or keep car, keep it, or keep it, the Pentagon, American again, come on it. Quilla, Bowler, whether Cambodia got you and don't do yellow. More like Vienna, what they pane, had 2 hours, so tell a tackle, I took the Leval Vienna, and the Cambodia call, who don't do you whenever Quilla the pound.
This was followed in March 1970 by the overthrow of Sihanouk's government in Phnom Penh.
I wanted to little talk with New Zealand, but I Pol Pot, go at what done it, let that do Yakikoya on it. I when it get out of that color, come on, do la power, see no weatherman.
By a pro-American coup d'etat, the Khmer Republic was now established with Prime Minister Lon Nol as its head. Sihanouk fled the country, but it was certainly not the end of his.
The lucky lane, when a couple of Tagaya, American. Did allow Cambodia and Penican metal sin of ne, where Kevada, where Puargala, come on at 2 America, Evaro. 2 lots of Jet 2 Yelekilla, but America, the Lenula people on a sin of the Bajilama. Bajia, where thought of what I thought of.
His role in Cambodian politics, Nol honored his commitments to Washington, and the Khmer Republic ordered the Viet Cong to leave Cambodian territory. But it was unable to effect this, and in the months that followed, the Viet Cong, with Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge as their allies, effectively established control over as much as 1/3 of Cambodia.
American. Tivada sin on the paper, the dollar will kill what a lot of and call pop when it's Huya. Hamone, the blue butter, pop when it blue butter, Cambodia and Plalo. Get a 1/3 or per Cambodia and the key and anyone.
Constituting the bulk of the north and east of the country. In the process, the Cambodian Civil War shifted from one which had been initiated to overthrow Sihanouk and his regime to one which sought to capture Cambodia for the Khmer Rouge from Lon Nol and his pro-American
when a la book pop when I what the weather sino one or sino one party did a sister. 9 kilo and Vienna where American le not plot over sino ne sino but you let Tiago le pola or London. London when a kekene to little border London London on a care what I love pro west or what I America or ba. I want to kekene aware Pol Pot ne what do la dictator shilo akela what do la what the weather London look wala amat quarter whether America the party mo la dala Pol Pot we mat quarter of Vienna la do America do ne ko ne do kayene plala or Pol Pot that do ne what do what tell what dictator shilo mi la what do whether pro America li mo kayene that get out yan
pro-Western government in Phnom Penh. 5 years of bloody conflict would follow between Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge.
The command when that do when a jig though that Jenny lucky come up Pol Pot play the London and the that Jenny no minute.
And Lon Nol's Khmer Republic, with one backed by the Viet Cong and the Chinese, and the other aided by the US. Pol Pot's cause also benefited in the early 1970s from a bizarre reconciliation between his Communist Party and Sihanouk, who had fled to China following the coup of 1970.
Come on, Cambodia ne dagene come on whether Sihanouk ne couple of America le not whether when ba le ji le to ko mo to ji to ko when do kwalo te do na ke wala America ko America wasn't a ke America do le papa ne what do whether ne what bad do whether America pwero you know mata ne I want to dagene bi pabi bunyam.
This brought the disparate rebel groups within Cambodia, who were opposed to Nol's government in Phnom Penh, into alliance with each other. Then, as the war intensified in the early 1970s, many thousands of pro-monarchy rebels joined the ranks of the
Batema le ki kitane wala who were pro-monarchy wala pro-monarchy ne ra tem ko lu lo no le wala Sihanouk the party ne wa the phane ke pro-monarchy wala khu cho pa the phane le ki lo ra kholo wa no ti do we cho pa ho lo cho pa ba ti ho ne ke ne common pro-monarchy the phane wa ta ba cho ro wala pala wa le not lo no ne wa ke ra bo la pro-America ho ro cái what no ne the two lot of pro-America ko America kana pa a do the pala the two lot wa qua come qua la ke wa pro law pro wa pro royal come on qua la ke wa cho pa wa the phane ke ne ki mat ko da Pol Pot ma da
the Khmer Rouge in the jungles of northern and eastern Cambodia, few of them having any real affinity with communist thought, but willing to support Pol Pot's struggle if they felt it aided the Cambodian monarchy. The ranks of the rebels soared to nearly 50,000 armed Cambodians by 1972. Simultaneously,
the tema le ki tane Pol Pot blue what tane apwane to kwiya nu shi ki ne Pol Pot ne tsang ne o da tu le ga ye ga la ya da
the Communist Party began to develop a more sophisticated party bureaucracy and the rudimentary basics of a revolutionary government, where responsibilities were delegated according to who would fill what ministerial brief, if and when the party was able to seize power in Phnom Penh in the years ahead.
Ako le ki ne te ti wa pla le kama de wa kan ne ma kama du la po wa da pa do le ba da cha cha ma je le America do ne ne ko no le ki ne pa te ma le o da ta ka te do do pa do wa da pa do la da pu me la po ha mni lo ne do da ka le ke ra ka da ko na le mo da te ya ne mo no
Join large-scale battles with military vehicles. The online action game War Thunder has received a major update.
As with so much of Cambodia's history since the end of the Second World War, the Civil War's outcome was broadly determined by events in wider Southeast Asia. From the late 1960s, the US had adopted a policy of exiting the Vietnam War in such a way
da pe de to ku ya ku si do le yu ki ne US ne o da ta cha te le ka ma ne wa ka ha da le Vienna ta de ko ma ka ma ta se do da la ba ma ka ma ne ka pa tu wa Vienna ta do ne de se ma wa la ba ma
it would preserve the independence of South Vietnam from its northern communist neighbor, or peace with honor, as President Nixon termed it. As the US began its long withdrawal from Vietnam in the early 1970s, its support for Lon Nol's regime in Phnom Penh diminished, in particular the bombing raids on the Viet Cong.
According to America to ku ya nu si ne America ha la ba ne but le le Cambodia ba ne pa le lan no ne na ke wada pa ga le America le ti do la mo ho do pa ka le ta cho ma che le ka ma ka ha du lo po wada kha kui lo wada pon le pa pu tho lo da ko wada ya le Pol Pot de phe de to o lo ba mo ka mo pa ka kui lo wada pon me wa ka lu kha me to o lo ba mo de wada awen ni pla le lo no de pha ne a phe si ne ka ri ba ne lo ta la mo.
The actions of the Khmer Rouge in northern and eastern Cambodia were temporarily ended by late 1972, and then, in January 1973, Lon Nol declared a ceasefire in the hopes that the civil war would be ended amicably, but it was not to be.
The lucky land in London, the TV le target cover ne ba bo la le tap to tak ham no.
Pol Pot and his militants continued their push westwards towards Phnom Penh, and it was clear by the spring of 1973 that they were in the ascendant. Lon Nol had to introduce conscription in order to have enough troops to defend the capital. But even so, the Khmer Rouge reached the outskirts of the city by April. They were prevented from seizing the seat of power at this time only through the intervention of the US, Nixon ordering a huge bombing campaign which drove Pol Pot's insurgents back into the jungle.
The bate malo mun ko ne London na we e do ma we tap to tak ha le te ko wa san ne me pho ne te tu lo wa ko ma ka set de we de le ko ma le de we de le ni lo ne e do te le ko no phlo wa da la no pho de le ni lo do bate la we ki de wa nu la de we da phon phen mo phen ni lo wa de we da phon phe se to ka ne no phen ne ko ba London ko ne la ko ba London ne ke ba ga le America le ti do do phen ni che to do America ne he ma che do phen ne peพ่อปวเลยหนึ่งเราว่าได้เวียนนาเอาไว้ประเดี๋ยวพอหน่อยพอเช็คต้อนเนาะอเมริกาคุยเราว่าได้ปองเลยพ่อได้เผยซีวันหนึ่งเนาะเนาะเลยคิดเราเนี่ยพ่อได้เผยซีเนี่ยแต่ละถึงมุติบอกว่าตัวเปียเราเนี่ยบักเกจิกได้ก็เลยป่าว
It was, however, only a limited reprieve. As the months rolled by and US aid dried up, Nol's government found itself increasingly unpopular and confined to a city, the population of which had swelled to nearly 2 million people, nearly 3/4 of them refugees. By March 1975, the Khmer Rouge and the Viet Cong had surrounded Phnom Penh with nearly 400,000 troops.
When America ne le kuy la pa when the blog we la ne le kin ne ta ma khö la pa tu la mo le kin la ne pla le lon no de pha ne thi bo ko bo ne ta tu lo a je ba pha mo ne wa tho da a ra mo no do phe ne mu ko le ne me kwa ga da ge le wa da ani la ne ko ba ko ne wa ne le kin ne pho phwe de pha ne le nu la ki ga da la ki di che be a wa ne pho de pha ne le nu la ne ba de le a pa tu po ne o tu le lui ga lo ya mo da tu le lui ga lo ne kha ma ne le ko wa da phna phe ma kha ma de pi nya ne ka ma le te la.
His insurgents on the 17th of April 1975, the Cambodian Civil War was over. The capital of South Vietnam, Saigon, fell to the Viet Cong just 13 days later.
De ba te to le ne le ki do le ni la da ma wa ni la mo do le ki na ge ne le san ko le ne pa da ge ne le Viet na pa na ge no a wa ne le a wa kho na ge ne Viet na ge ma ni wa da we kho la mo wa de.
On the 30th of April 1975, as Western efforts to stop the spread of socialist regimes in Southeast Asia ended in dismal failure in the spring of 1975. The Cambodian Civil War was over. Approximately 250,000 Cambodians had been killed.
The ba te ma le tu le pho du dan du no wa da no thwe da wa da le no phwe ni la ne pa wa da le ta du ta ya ne wi phe ne mo kho ma ne pa ti wa da khle to plo ne to da la ka a wa 250,000 ne lui ga kwe ka ka ma chi mo da ne no a wa da pi pha nya mo da te wa da.
In nearly 8 years of conflict, but few knew what the future now held in store for the country. Despite being the main rebel organization during the Civil War, the Khmer Rouge was something of an unknown quantity. In international circles, Pol Pot and his party were viewed as something of an ancillary to the Viet Cong presence in Cambodia. Few, though, knew what they would do once in power, nor could they have predicted the scale of the brutality which would now be unleashed throughout the country. Even Pol Pot himself was a relatively shadowy figure, of whom the world knew little in 1975. But that would all change in the years that followed. Having seized power, the Khmer Rouge unleashed a savage assault on Cambodian society itself, the horrors of which have been eclipsed by few regimes in human history.
Nagane de le Pol Pot patela wa chumo non bla la mi ni kita soda ma la wa ma to ma ti ma wa ne ma no le ki ta ne patem ma le te wa kha ma tu me Pol Pot ne wa di plot wa da lo no te ya pa do bo pa wi lo ne wa talk wa ke da wa pa do pa ke da wa ko ko ne wa da patela wa do da wa ta so te so kha le to ma na te.
At the heart of the nightmare which unfolded in the months and years after the end of the Civil War was the ideological platform, the Communist Workers' Party of Kampuchea, with Pol Pot as its leader. It had grown and developed in the 10 years or so since they first began building up their strength in the jungles of northeast Cambodia in the mid-1960s. The party was wedded to the idea of building an agrarian revolution, one in which rural peasants would form the basis of their communist state. As we saw earlier, Pol Pot had little understanding of communist thought himself, and this ideology that the Khmer Rouge developed.
Di da le mo ko la da ko pa da wa ma lo ne wa da Khmer sa ta chumo chuma ba kha le community do tu la wa ke da ke khun na le bla kha ne ta chumo chuma ne he ke wa da community kha ma ti ko wa ne ba o tu to o ti to ta the to ti to kha ma ne ba do ba pa ti da ba ne ka ba kha ma ne ka ba ne tu ba ko ma le ba ka ba he le ba do ba pa o la ne ba do ba ne ka ba ki he la ke ti ba ko wa ta ta chumo chuma ti ba ne he pa ra ka da ke di da le te wa da kha ma ne Pol Pot we ma lo wa da Khmer sa ta chumo chuma da ne to mi la na pa wa kha le ba ma da te wa.
Had little to do with the writings of Karl Marx. Indeed, they were directly antithetical. Marx had envisaged a revolution driven by the urban proletariat of oppressed factory workers. Conversely, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge
Awe tu ta do le anti-ethical ne kama ne Pol Pot ne di la we ta le communist ideology ne ta le ethical ne ma wa da le ta le ne ma la ne ba da do tu do ta ke le ba na ne Pol Pot na wa ke chomo da ne ke da le ta ma le ka ma ne de fa ne ki ne a ke da pa la ma la ne ta do tu do ta ro ma kama.
viewed urban workers as dangerous subversives and wanted to encourage Cambodians to return to the countryside from the cities in order to create an almost exclusively agrarian society. This utopian dream of theirs would soon become a nightmare for the Cambodian people. As soon as Phnom Penh had been seized in April 1975, Pol Pot quickly made his way to the city. He entered the capital on the 20th of April, and by May had established his government at the Silver Pagoda, an opulent 19th century royal palace which had once been home to the monarchy. It was not at once clear that Pol Pot and the Communist Party would be the primary power in the new Cambodia, not least because a number of regional military leaders commanded their own power bases throughout the country. There was even an effort made to unseat Pol Pot in the autumn of 1976, but ultimately the party prevailed and solidified its power. Then the name of the country was officially changed to Democratic Kampuchea in January 1976, and it was governed by a standing committee of the Khmer Rouge's leading figures, who were named as brothers. Pol Pot was brother number 1 and served as prime minister.
Come on, ta le ro te ne Pol Pot ne wa de wa da le no ne a phwe ne lo po li ji li ji ba na ke ne wa no ne ji le ke lo pa bu na ke ne a sa de mi Pol Pot ne o do du ji la me ya no come on ta le ta de ta ya ne come on ne ro te da Pol Pot ne wa min du da min ne ba na ke ne ko wa solidify power ne come on le come man ne ma ta chat te le ta hi khoi no la ta su da ko mo ne do ba come on ne wa le shu du da ba ti la wa le ne du da pa da la do pa de le len ti la wa Pol Pot pa la ne phe ne pe de check top phe ne pa do pa pa ne ko da le brother yan la mo come on ne ke da le pa de du pa de ta pa ta pra do when ne ke da le first brother wa ko le first brother when in double when no get there Pol Pot wa ko phe ne no.
For a time, the former king, Sihanouk, was even brought into the government in an effort to prevent him becoming a focus of opposition to the new regime.
Come on, le dim la wa ke da wa ko wa da pa ko na le ki ne pa te le a wa na ne ko mu ga wa sin no ne le sin no ma no cho pa ne le ke ki ga da ke di da le come on ne cho da le ti la ko bu ta la da ta du ta ya ta lo wa la tu ba la ta to le ke di da le ka come on ก็บ่บ้าก็ว่าตาอุตาที่ผ่านมาเตะ
But he resigned from his position in the spring of 1976 and was subsequently kept under house arrest by the regime, which is how the Khmer Rouge kept their control of the country in the first 12 months after the end of the civil war. The policies pursued by Pol Pot
เขามาเนี่ยว่าก่อว่าสนาเกเนี่ยก่อว่าสินว่าสนาเลยคิดเนี่ยว่าพ่อไว้ดอกฮักเกี่ยวได้เลยก็เลยที่ละมั้งประเทศรักตัวเลยเนี่ยเขามาเนี่ยมาว่าโชว์ขาละมั้งดอกพ่อเนี่ยที่ตัวว่า ideology เนาะเขามาว่าเลยมาเนี่ยข้ามมาสัตว์ชุ่มมาเนาะก็เลยเว็บผู้ที่ผ่านเนี่ยมาว่าตาหาเราเลยเว็บเคลียร์ดอกมาว่าตาตัวว่าพลาออกมาตาพีดามาตาเขามาเนี่ยเอาไว้ได้เลยว่าป้องใส่เนาะ
and the Khmer regime in the second half of the 1970s have become infamous. As we have seen, the regime constructed itself around the idea of creating an agrarian revolution with a kind of rural proletariat. Pot and his allies were inspired by the Great Leap Forward which Chairman Mao had attempted in China 20 years earlier, whereby he had attempted to drastically increase China's food production and industrial output in just a few short years.
เขามาเนี่ยเดี๋ยวจีถ้าชุ่มมาเนี่ยให้เรามีอ้อบ้านเนี่ยอ้อบ้านดีต่อคนเนาะแต่ละชุกตัวกันมันต้าเนี่ยเรโดที่ว่าคนเนาะดีต่อเรื่องมอสิตัวนั้นเราว่าสารตัวก็ได้ที่เนี่ยว่าเขามาสาเดียวจีถ้าชุ่มเนี่ยส่วนเนี่ยเอาแต่ละมาชุกตัวกันเนี่ยตาสุดาพลายละเดี๋ยวใครนั่งเนี่ยพอนั่งเนี่ยแต่ละสารมาว่าชุกตัวกันเนี่ยมาที่พวกเขาสุดาพลายละ
The Great Leap Forward failed spectacularly and is now understood to have resulted in the deaths of as many as 50 million Chinese people in the space of 5 or 6 years. But, undeterred by this appalling record, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge now sought to use similar methods to exponentially increase Cambodia's agricultural and manufacturing capacities. The ultimate goal was to make Cambodia self-sufficient and reliant on no other state for the goods which it needed. In particular, Pol Pot wished to avoid having the country fall under the influence of its more powerful neighbor to the east in Vietnam. Cambodian self-sufficiency was to be achieved through collectivization, whereby farms throughout the country were brought under state ownership and then run collectively or
common ideology เนี่ยว่าเดี๋ยวได้เลยมาที่พวกเขาสู้ได้ดูเธอแล้วเนี่ยจะลุกไปได้เลยที่ก็ว่าจะลุกดอทนี้ได้เลยว่าแล้วเนี่ยเนี่ยก็จ่ายได้เว้ยเนี่ยคอมมานด์หมดเลยมันเลยป่วยเนี่ยนมูซีละนักก็จะได้เลยไม่มีได้เลยมาสิโตมาเว้ยเนี่ยมาว่าภาษาเนี่ยข้อมูลเว็บ policy เว้ยเนี่ยเกี่ยวกับเล็กๆเนี่ยเกี่ยวกับได้เลยตาวิลดูเธอมาคอมมานด์ได้เลยป่วยป่ะคอมมานด์เลยมุกโลกกว่าที่ผ่านเนี่ยบ้านโดมาโอเคเนี่ยค่าข้อเลยเว็บมาสิโตมาเว้ยเนี่ยเลยป่วยได้ว่าคอมมานด์เนี่ยเอาไว้แค่เนี่ยพอเนี่ยตัวเมธอดค่าข้อหรือไม่เดี๋ยวนะ
communally by farmers. The goal was to have the country's agricultural output increased substantially by forcing Cambodians to work as hard as possible. To this end, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge immediately began forcing the population to leave Cambodia's cities and relocate to labor camps in the countryside to work on collective farms. Conditions in these were brutal, often amounting to little more than slave labor. Workers were beaten and tortured if they did not work sufficiently hard enough. They were fed poorly, often so that camp overseers could report on high production yields, and malnutrition was soon rife.
Ta chomo di le kala wa kala de wa lo we bu de pha ne ma wa ta ha ta khala le ma na o de ta ma lo de pha da tu phla lo de le kila ne khamela ta da to le wa le wa ma wa le phi da ma na de pha no ta de du o le pwe wa le kila lo mi de ma na wa me tho le de shu de kle ba da wa ma de ma lo do de no ne ke da wa le ta ti ta bwa ma de wa da ma no.
Giving way eventually to death through starvation. As conditions in Kampuchea's work camps deteriorated during the course of 1976 and 1977, disease became rife in them also, exacerbating the level of mortality. Workers who refused to work hard enough or resisted directives were executed. The barbaric conditions of the labor camps in the countryside were not the sole theatre in Pot's Cambodia where mass murder was occurring. The Khmer Rouge established itself as a highly autocratic, xenophobic, classist, and totalitarian regime. People from the middle and upper class were murdered in large numbers simply for having the most tenuous links to the ruling elites of past years, or being seen as bourgeois subversives. All this despite Pol Pot's own upper-middle-class family background. Foreigners were targeted also. For instance, 250,000 Cambodians of Chinese ethnicity were killed between 1975 and 1979.
အခမ်းမတဲ့ ideology ဘက်ကလည်းအဲ့ဒါတော်တော် community ခမ်းမတဲ့ဘာတော့တပတ်ဘာဖော့တော့ဘာနဲ့ခမလတာကေဘာကောနေတင်လဖော့နေတာဆိုတာကမလေးလာနေတော့ဘာလာကဲတော့ကဲထောအဲ့ဖာနေဘာတမတီရတော့တူလားအဲ့ဒါတော်တော်အာဂါကဘာနေတော့ဘာလာကဲစစ်ကောရကမ္ဘောဒီးယားကလစ်စစ်စီရတော့တရုတ်သေးပါစမတော့ဘာတမတီရရလားတော့လင်းနေမင်းရတော့ဘာလာကဲဝရဘာတော့ခါပါလို့ကျတော့လေမွန်စလီတဲ့ဖာနေတော့ဘာတမတီရဘာတမခေါ်လို့တော့တမတီရတော့တူရလားဝဲနေကွယ်နော်ကနေဒါလည်းမွန်စလီတဲ့ဖာနေဘာတမတီရဒီလာကလည်းကလောရမှာခမနေအဝဲနေတလတဘလခေါနေကောလည်း equality တတ်ထက်တော့တူတော်စီရနေ ideology ရနေဝဲရှင်းနာကဲလည်းကမတေးမှာခမတဲ့တဲတာလည်းမျိုးလည်းနေမျိုးလည်းကမ္ဘောဒီးယားကောနေဘာကဲဝရဝါဘာဘူးဒါလည်းကမ္ဘောဒီးယားနဲ့ကဲဝတော့ခါတီကောနေဘာတော့ခါတော့နေမျိုးဝရလည်းခေါင်းကကဲဝဘာတော့ခါတော့နော်ဘာကမ္ဘောဒီးယားကောရတော့ဘာကဲဝကမ္ဘောဒီးယားဖိုးလို့အဝဲနေကဲဝရ ideology တခါလည်းတတ်ထက်တော့တူတော် ideology နေအဝဲနပ်ပေါ်ကမတော့တတူကမရနေမနော်အဝဲနေတလ equality တော့ difference အဝဲ differential နေဝဲနေအလောချောတယ်နေပေါ့မှာတဘလခေါနေမကလည်းမတူလောတလောချောနေတဘလတူလောတထက်တော့အပိုစလည်းရတယ်ခမတဲ့ ideology လေအဝဲဖော်လေဟိနေဝရနေခမတထက်တော့တူတော့မြဝဲဟီလေတကောမြတပုတဘာနေကဘာဒီတော့ကလူနာကဘာဒီတော့မေဖော်တော့ဒီတော့မေကဲတော့ခေါ် ideology ဒီပိုင်းနေခမတဲ့တေရလောပွားကဲတော့ကဲထောဖေဖော်ကဲရခုနာချက်တော့နေဘာကဲတော့ကဲထောသေးပါနေဘာတမတီရတော့တူညမှာတဲ့
with perhaps as many as 100,000 Muslims also murdered. The state also established itself as an atheistic regime, and Buddhism was savagely repressed. Anyone who was seen to resist the government became the victim of a...
No, the caravan, London, Yanino. Well, Tachumo Mother, but not atheist Yakamani. Telecommunine, done a Kagada, atheist Yana, okay. Come on, Tabuta Banana, those so say me, I want it. Elikilan, Tabuta Banana, Tokana, the $2, come on, atheist Yakamani, okay. Tala Chorova, Komata, Tabuta Banana, Dochi, Ajgarova, Dobala Metoda, Vado, Wadi, Likini, Papa, me, Matama, Tigu, well, leg animal. According to me, quite a China and Candy, Tabuta Balado, so no cover. Or Takada Buddha, so I don't know. Creep water over the corner, where common aware. Comatabuta, one I Utagala, Lola, Tether to Dolomala, could do solo choice over by the tenor. Tell the Cambodia, Lacotia, take a radical bill, Tokane, do so more, Comatabuta, do so. Tokana night to the Pol Pot, I thought can I do so the Nilo at Danile. Cotigane, Kabadi, the Tane, Matimo Silly with the Calo, eh? Tokane, do so the Niva, come on. Tikobe, Tambuta Balado, so don't bow no cover. Come on, Takala bottle or the Toyanum. When the two attacked to the atheist state panel.
Arrest and execution, and over 150 torture and execution centers were established throughout the country, the most notorious being S21, a converted secondary school, through which as many as 20,000 prisoners passed between 1976 and 1979. As the months went by, paranoia came to dominate every aspect of Cambodian society. Children were indoctrinated into the regime's atrocities and forced to engage in killings. In other instances, the children of political dissenters or ethnic minorities who were killed were also murdered. The Russian of Pol Pot, and the regime being that they wanted to avoid these children growing up and seeking to avenge their parents. All of this took place in the killing fields.
But there are them go come on more part of Nobale Pile Milo, made Peter Maro, Batama Tiu or more part of Nolo, made a two low, but policy Tama, Televa, Tama Theatre. Put the potato pine, Titola, Medora, me do la ga ga di do le te do ma wa ta hi ka ba do ko ne pdo ba de pha ne ba de ki ne pdo ba pho ne ga ti ti do lo ko ne ma ti ti ne o ji lo mo
Sites throughout Cambodia where mass executions were carried out in the years following Pol Pot's ascent to power. At these sites, individuals were sometimes killed using sharpened bamboo, scythes and pickaxes to save bullets. Some victims were forced to dig their own graves before being executed.
do ba te ma le ta ma ti ma wa ne a tu da le ko ma ne ma ti we le che ti we le wa de no de to ti we da le a wa da le khe le kwa de no ne ba khu la ga cha bu ka ma ta ma ti ma wa ne a to lo ma wa ne ko ba le ba de le ideology de ka le ko wa le equality wa ne ko max ya ne me ko ne pho de to me ke do de to ne kina da ta ne ready ko ora da chu mo de pa ne mo no.
Often poor farmers and peasants were forced to carry out these executions in order to avoid punishment themselves by the regime. Such was the barbarity of the Khmer Rouge and the unmitigated terror and destruction of life which it unleashed, that by the end of the 1970s, somewhere between 1.7 and 2.2 million of Cambodia's population of approximately 8 million people had been killed.
Ya te wera khoblo phe pho ra chak to ne pa ti bu ko bo di ba ne ba ta ma ti ma wo me ge le lo do lo bu ga me ge khoma ne ke ti ra le kho ko kwe kha ya mo.
The Cambodian genocide overseen by Pol Pot and orchestrated by the Khmer Rouge was one of the most heinous and vicious genocides ever undertaken.
Da we ne ke wa ta ma ti ma wo kha le to so le ho klo ne de da te ta ne do lo ba mo da te ne.
This game, you're not ready for it.
It is hard to look beyond the genocide to try to find any coherent policies which might have been implemented by Pol Pot's regime, and it is perhaps unsurprising to find that these were, in any event, dictated by the ideological brutality and totalitarianism of the Khmer Rouge as well. For instance, the party's approach to education was mired in a highly repressive and paranoid approach to learning and the role of teachers in society. Upon the fall of Phnom Penh in 1975, several thousand educators were executed across the city. A new curriculum was devised, which sought to teach little more than basic mathematics and literacy, and thereafter was focused on instilling the regime's political ideology.
The le phe la pho wa ke ro wa kun na lo ki ne ba te ma le a wa le chu le ko da le ne wa so lo wa da ba kha le ideology te pha le ba te ma le community ideology social ideology ta chu mo chu ma da po la wa de pa la ku se la ga te pha do no ne ba ta ma ti ma wa ku pa le me tho da wa da chu mo chu ma di de lu ma no ba de le ta do da le ne wa so lo wa da le to phu po la ma da te ne.
Into the minds of students. Consequently, some children were fashioned into enthusiastic contributors to the state's atrocities. The health system also effectively collapsed under Pol Pot's reign of terror, with many physicians executed on class grounds. On the economic front, currency was abolished, and a barter system was introduced, along with the state-run distribution of goods. As a result, Cambodians were soon trading their few personal possessions in order to acquire basic goods. Foreign trade almost completely dried up, but most strikingly, the goal of drastically improving agricultural output was a catastrophic failure.
The common ideology one likine ora kama the late time gona kama ko the kama da we ka cha order we ka kama ne de do tin la ti a ko ga ba ta ti pa ne policy ti pa ne ma ala la ne ke ro ta ko ta ke ta na ta po ta ti ta pa le kama ya ko dot be ya mo when ti a ko ga na ke do ta pu da cha ro pa de la close se de ba da cho ta le we when ta pu da cha ra ti a ko na ni to o lo ma da te.
The reverse, famine, was endemic as the months and years passed by. On the foreign policy front, Pol Pot's approach mirrored his desire to make Cambodia self-sufficient. Isolationism was favored. Consequently, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge spurned the Western powers, including the US, with which the previous administration in Phnom Penh had been so closely associated. Those states which Pol Pot established good relations with were usually headed by fellow autocrats, such as Nicolae Ceausescu of Romania. The Soviet Union was rejected as a source of support, despite being the ostensible head of the communist bloc. in favor of aligning Kampuchea with China. Chairman Mao committed over $1 billion of Beijing's money in aid to help rebuild and develop Cambodia in the aftermath of the Civil War, and many civil and military advisors were sent to Southeast Asia to provide advice on how to develop the Cambodian economy, although the relationship cooled considerably from 1976 onwards with the death of Mao that year, and the Cambodian regime's increasingly hostile approach to ethnic Chinese Cambodians. But the most consequential relationship of the Khmer regime was with its neighbor to the east, with whom its recent history had been so entangled. Following the end of the Civil War, relations between Cambodia and a united Vietnam quickly deteriorated, and in the summer of 1976, negotiations to resolve some border disputes between the two countries failed. Thereafter, relations thawed considerably. Little could Cambodians have known at that time, but the communist regime in Vietnam would soon provide a kind of salvation for the people of Pol Pot's Cambodia.
Khmer te wada ke khala ba le tem ko ne da le kine America ne hala wada le Vietnam la le te le Vietnam ta du ne we wada la ma Khmer Vietnam communist le Vietnam ne ma na da do le Cambodia da ba ru do ba te da do le do pho phwe de ba ne du phlo wada la no phwe da la no phwe na ke ne ba chi we le kwa wu la ma a ko ne na ke ne ta ke ko no te khala ko ki pe de ne ta de ki pe la le ba sa teacher ko chone มาว่าตัดเช็ดเด็ดนี่วะเขาเลยมาเนี่ยตัดเช็ดเด็ดนี่วะคนนี่ดอกบาเวียนนาโวเดตพาเนี่ยเขาบอกเนี่ยตัดมือว่าได้พอวะเขาบอกเลยมาตัดเช็ดเด็ดนี่วะก็ดอกมาตัดมือว่าได้พอวะเขาบอกเลยตัดมือวะคนนี่ดอกเขาบอกเลยมาที่เช็ดก็เช็ดตัดเช็ดเด็ดนี่วะเขาบอกข้อเช็ดมั้งเขาบอกว่าแต่เนี่ยตาอย่าตาเนี่ยนี่คนนี่ดอกแค่เนี่ยพลาดว่าเขาบอกเนี่ยแต่ละเล็กขี้เนี่ยเวียนนาเนี่ยว่ากี่ชอบช่วยกี่มาเจอกันได้ก็ว่าได้เลย là nó phải là ô là bra bu du ne ô là pa là thọ da wa pho du ne ke ne Vienna ne awe ki sa ro ma tyak da wa kho ma ne ta du ta ya ne awe thi lo ko ta du ta ya ne wi li ngo la wi blo li phe pho du ne wa la na so ta ne thi lo ko bu ta du ta ya ne ba te la a o lo ba ne te lo o na yo o ke de che de mo ya ne a ke wa du tho la ba ma ba sa na ke ne ko bu le ta ke ko le teacher ko ja ta ke ko ne ba Vienna wa te pa ne ka awa te wa mo khamo ne awa ne ka chot chwe ka da wa da pa la awa ji wo mu le kwa bu de pa la tho da pho de pa no.
Relations between Cambodia and Vietnam were in terminal decline by 1978. The previous December, the Vietnamese had sent tens of thousands of troops over the border to contested regions and broke off relations with Phnom Penh, although it soon withdrew in the first weeks of 1978. Pol Pot responded by ordering raids along the border region. War was not officially entered.
The battle koto ha ne ta ba ge gu no mo ti ko ki be ne ta ba ge gu no the Vietnam ne so we so do tho le culture le common le Vietnam culture le kham cha culture la ba na do phi ne kha ne pho ne order lo wa tu do tu lo le culture do pe ne ta du ta ya du o de che ne ba sa na ge de me le ko ka patele officially la ka bo ba ra lo ne ka du ya du na di do di ba ma do le ki ne Vietnam ne wa da phe so ka ne mo Vietnam ne wa da ki tu la sa wa so ma da de
into at this point, but the unrest was the spark to see resistance to Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge begin to emerge within Cambodia. Such was the anarchy and brutality that prevailed throughout the country that several regional military commanders were now moving through the country to distance themselves from the regime. In a desperate bid to bolster his support, Pol Pot courted Sihanouk, who was still under house arrest, to throw his support behind the regime, a sign of his increasing desperation. And then, in December 1978, the inevitable war broke out.
The battle to le pho ne kho la wa po da so the a policy de pa ne o theta ma ti ma wa da na da pho ko ne do wa tu pho tu na na ge ne la o khu wa de pa ne de do khu wa la ba e do ke chot chwe ga da ge ba la tho da wa da pho de pa ne mo do le ki to ne ti la ko ba da du da ya ne ke da ko do wa da to blog do ma me de do le to phe to tho khwi ya nwi chi ko ne a wa ne ta du da ya ne he phe la di se ma ne ta du da ya ne he sa da ko do do.
The Vietnamese-Cambodian War began on Christmas Day 1978.
The penny, but then my learner pay to talk queer and Nishi Corner when it while Vienna Polar Church Cambodia other penny when it's Sarawata do over when Sarawata do not know do with a Cambodia.
When the Vietnamese launched a full-scale invasion of Cambodia. Over 150,000 Vietnamese troops.
No penny on it, do me Sarat do block on it. Vienna and Shalawat, the lot of Jagalam, like no, do with a what a pop up doing, but do pure with a papa where a pattern.
Troops, many of them hardened veterans from the long Vietnam War, and led by seasoned military commanders, streamed over the border. The invaders quickly overran the country. Northeast Cambodia had been captured by the end of 1978.
Dobitella, couple of new lawyer, what's the lot better, so that doing is sal block on it. Le Patemas December and La January, quit calling up there at the end of Toku and music on whatever. Cambodia got one and Vienna doing it out there.
And then on New Year's Day, the main Vietnamese forces began their approach to Phnom Penh. As the Cambodian army's resistance melted away in the opening days of 1979, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge regime began evacuating the capital.
The Tilakilane, what do I do with a capital of Phnom Penh? Papa, these are them called a collar, put up, brother, the common policy dependent to the order. As the multi-ball church was the panel in it, who could I say go by thought down a papa the honor. But then my little papa to me one nigger, we call on it. Papa, a party the panel, Bahara. But G with them, tell it, but Jima, evacuating, but 2,000, but what about Jima, but Gida we call.
Many senior members fled to Thailand, while Pot.
The papa the about Copa Nadan, Papa, Puamat, Kodakuna, let you actually you call it.
Himself headed for the city of Battambang, the regional capital of the Northwest.
The well level again, but what I love with call up Panama when I was Pevin of Pendulum of Pabasanagan, Gia Gemma.
Phnom Penh fell on the 7th of January 1979.
The Pedro Tokuya, Nuchi Queen, when upon a penny, when a log without a but there were Vienna Jubu, Minimana, while that hot dog what all, whether Papa the Panel Jubuloma.
To the Vietnamese, who now established a new People's Republic of Kampuchea.
The Tulikilana Tadu Kera, what a do a call, the weather, Papoda Prada do a call, or that people Republic of Kampuchea,
headed by Cambodian exiles who had fled to Vietnam in recent times to avoid the purges of Pol Pot and
the one a letter Coromene, but it follow Papa. Did I them call a Papa now? I do love for learn about another do what do love for all Kampuchea water, lower to Vienna, Conomo, what did Pana to love Papa, but Tigda Lora, Hekila, what talk or Mega animal,
and the Khmer Rouge. The war seemed to have been won in a matter of days, and Pol Pot and his regime utterly defeated.
The Badella Jala Dobuni, Taduni, Widow. But let's go out of Papa when a Shulam.
But then foreign powers yet again intervened in Cambodia's affairs. Following the initial flush of victories, the Vietnamese and their Cambodian allies were stopped in their advances when China invaded northern Vietnam in mid-February 1979.
No, that anymore, come on. Our Pol Pot again, our community corridor. Community, I got done a community to Kaila, that ideology to do colonate Kaila. Flower, Papa on in where our common, but they have to learn where pair Vienna let do it. Our couple chance of talking in our opinion or whether Tarunagan in Lena do whether Vienna, did all of Vienna, and two said do whether Cambodia Capucha by one.
Although the Sino-Vietnamese War which ensued lasted less than a month and a ceasefire had been agreed by mid-March, the attack was sufficient to give the Khmer Rouge and many other militant groups in Cambodia time to regroup and organize their resistance to the Vietnamese-backed government in Phnom Penh.
When a lucky lot of better, but do whether the loud or death quadra, what did the panic, but the Papura, did the touch where come my jugada. But they are like a church of my jeweda, Puala, oh, whether a comma Puala, Puala do flower, Papa to do the more.
During this period, Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge allies took advantage of the distraction offered by China's intervention to establish control over parts of the northwest of the country along the border with Thailand. Armed with financial and military aid from China and the United States, Pot was trying, in the summer of 1979, to reinvent the Khmer Rouge. Efforts were made to disavow the party's former socialist past and actions, while Pot tried to position himself as the leader of a new patriotic democratic front, and
When come on, that do that, yeah, show them up. What? A common pop on again, what do flow, well, attack las in again, when I have Syrian again, regular that ye, the Wakuda macho, American again, Lalele macho, that pop, the Palole, you corner again, Lalele macho, that pop, common at Su, with that Potala Margarada, a come up in a gun and I could do Florida Vienna, come on Vienna, and our Papula that a common Cambodia, Tila, Cambodia, Tiquata, Dutayane. Thì là có một đại diện nó là từ cái trò khi cái trò từ cái trò mà đây là từ là từ cái trò khi cái trò từ cái trò này và bù đó là đó là thọ đào đó French the là sino cho pa French the cho pa này và thọ đào này mình thọ đào mình từ thọ đào bắt đầu vừa này ta beli vừa khi này xia là sino này và cho pa sino này không mà bữa đó bữa đó chạy vàoคนđó Paket hodaก็ว่าซีโนเนี่ยตัวก็เอาวันนี้ถ้าดูได้ยาเป็นตัวก็วันที่เราเข้าไปได้ยาก็นะเล่นซีโนเนี่ยบาจีเนาะซีโนบาจีแล้วมั้งซีโนบาจีแล้วเนี่ยเล็กที่เราเนี่ยไปได้แล้วพอเนี่ยก็ปัตตาเล็กที่ได้เนี่ยวัดดูว่าซีโนเพื่อคำว่าซีโนเพื่อเนี่ยพอเราลีนอลาพาร์ตี้เนี่ยก็เนี่ยพอเนี่ยดูเนื้อละพอดูเนื้อเวลาคิดว่าพอเนี่ยเปิดบลูนี่ยังเปิดบลูนี่ว่าเปิดเนี่ยว่าตูดเกย์ก่อนบ้าก็รอเขาพูดอะไรแล้วที่ก่อนเนี่ยตาก็ก่อโอ้ยอะไรเลยเวียนน่ะนะครับบูชาตาก็ก่อที่จะก่อนจะก่อนเนี่ยเวียนน่ะให้เรานึกดูดอกค่ะแค่เนี่ยให้เรานึกดูว่าได้พอเปิดอ่ะนึกเอาพอเนี่ยดูพลอได้พอเปิดอ่ะดูพลอเปิดนั่นเนี่ยพอนั่นเนี่ยเปิดนั่นเนี่ยดูพลอเนี่ยพลอเขาเลิกอ่ะพลอเขาเลิกอ่ะคนละดอกเพลอตัวเลยเรานึกเราดูว่าได้เวียนน่ะเชิงตอนนี้เนาะเวียนน่ะนะคือบาดโอ้เลยก็ดูว่าได้คัมพูชาเอาไว้กัมพูชาก่อนเนี่ยดอดบี้ป่ะเชิงตอนนี้เนาะเป็นพอเปิดเนี่ยก็รู้ว่าแต่เราKhuda mà chờ lấy dù con mình đó là mình cả đã là này ta cho mà cháu bây giờ còn được plug ra cái viên nào thì đủ rồi mỗi cái là viên nào là hết được là nương là viên nào là hết nương là được cái đó pop để đủ này cái viên nào để đủ gọi là cái company viên nào là về được America shoot để đủ nữa con rồi thay là cái America này cho ra pop gì mà ở đây là ta được cái con mà này
alliance of disparate political and military groups which opposed the Vietnamese-backed regime in Phnom Penh. The leader of the Khmer Rouge even attempted to reinvent himself by dropping his pseudonym, Pol Pot, and adopting the name Pem, after his father. Incredibly, these actions won him some credibility on the international stage, and in November 1979, the United Nations chose to recognize the Khmer Rouge as the government of Cambodia over the administration in Phnom Penh.
nó có này pop này bữa đó này tao nát khử na cái này dạ ta không có ta cái vào con không có community không có taru bây giờ là không có về Vienna hay là từ về đó về đó Campuchia hoặc là về pop này mà cái đó ta từ đó ta real là thì có cái này à cái về bảo phu là ở đây ta số đang nói là thế về cái là này về mà cái đó ta lo này anh cái là này bữa đó là United Nations mà này về recognize là cái đó regime de phu là apartheid là Cambodia có lắm
Despite the appalling crimes of the regime in recent years, the full extent of which was admittedly still unknown to the world in 1979. Thus, by the end of the first year of the Cambodian-Vietnamese War, the stage was set for an extended showdown between the Vietnamese and their puppet regime in Phnom Penh and the many militant groups which controlled much of the country, and of which the Khmer Rouge was just one. This was effectively a new civil war in Cambodia. It would last as long as that which had first brought Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge to power in 1975. The Cambodian-Vietnamese War lasted for another 10 years. The Khmer Rouge was just one of the militant groups fighting against the People's Republic of Kampuchea and Vietnam in these years. Foremost amongst these other groups was the National United Front for an Independent, Neutral, Peaceful and Cooperative Cambodia, or Phun Sin Pac, which was formed in 1981 by the stalwart of Cambodian politics, the former king Sihanouk. Then, in an effort to win over more support for the Khmer in response to the formation of Sihanouk's Funcinpec, Pol Pot officially dissolved the Communist Party in 1981.
The lucky line, come out to the carbon, that do that, ya. Do not turn my theme, what the other lorry. The king of Popona and two low that a communicati when it come along Magwema, command a good party let all the Tilacopo down the Kubu.
And proposed a new nationalist movement, an indication of his ongoing ideological flexibility. Then, as the fighting wore on, in an interminable series of guerrilla attacks in the jungles and foothills of Cambodia in the mid-1980s, Pol Pot began moving away from the forefront of the movement, and in September 1985, he resigned as the military commander of the Khmer Rouge.
The Pedotokuya Hosian and Lekina when Obu when my papa or Kelawada, I let the cook lullaby, Mora.
In part owing to reverses the previous year, when the Vietnamese had pushed the Khmer forces into Thailand from Cambodia, and in part owing to his own declining health. In 1983, he was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, a relatively severe type of cancer, which required him to spend extensive periods of time in Bangkok and Beijing, receiving medical treatment.
I saw war. I saw moving. I saw.
As the war dragged on interminably into the late 1980s, Pol Pot began to make it known to political elements within Cambodia and abroad that he would not seek to return to power should the war end. Rather, his sole wish was to see the Vietnamese removed from Cambodia, or at least that is what he claimed. As ever, this statement came about largely owing to wider geopolitical circumstances. By the end of the decade, the communist bloc worldwide was in decline, and the Cold War was drawing to an end, as it did Vietnam, which had been largely ostracized from the global community since the 1970s, determined to bring its role in Cambodia to an end also.
The lucky never damn to learn it. Pol Pot come out with a para, you the chocolate gila, what they are bacala tea cogging it at a keki. Come out a dead or he talk or mel, but I tell a dog where can it get a love Vienna and a Kahara. Our Cambodia Gobumono. The Lenin line in the Cold War Bacala community that do the Viet, but then my community specially that do Nagini. Our Cato penny or Lekilani, but then my Vienna Nagini, our say. The lead do without Cambodia, our with dog without a third Pamono.
1988, it began withdrawing the nearly 100,000 troops which it had in Cambodia, and instituted a series of political and economic reforms designed to prop up the People's Republic of Kampuchea and to fully disentangle itself from the country. And by September 1989, it had withdrawn the last of its troops from the country. Once a ceasefire was proclaimed in 1990, peace negotiations began between the various groupings within Cambodia to find a workable way forward in establishing the country. Despite its crimes, while in power between 1975 and 1979, the Khmer Rouge, with Pol Pot as its leader, would play a part in these negotiations. In the talks which followed, Pol Pot remained in an obscure location near the border between Thailand and Cambodia, and instead dispatched his close associate in the Khmer Rouge, Khieu Samphan, to Phnom Penh to represent the party. Here, negotiations largely centered around Samphan, Sihanouk, and the head of the pro-Vietnamese faction Hun Sen. Samphan struck an antagonistic pose in the capital, declaring that the Khmer Rouge refused to disarm its troops in western Cambodia. In response, Sen and Sihanouk proved similarly recalcitrant. As a result, sporadic fighting continued throughout the early 1990s.
Vienna, Kabucha Tagin, Katali, Bazala, Bazanagan, Kawada, Pap, Kabucha, de Tagin, Pol Pot, Seed or Penigan Hussein, Mawala, Tokurome, Wala, Hot Dog, Pol Pot, who said, I call her Kakaimono, our Tokurome, whether, come on, a Pakian at the Manita Lover. That do say what to let Tokuya cuisine monitor.
even as negotiations continued in Phnom Penh. Eventually, it was agreed that national elections would be held in the early summer of 1993. The results were a sharp rebuttal of Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge, with Sen and Sihanouk's parties cumulatively winning nearly 80% of the vote.
The lucky return to Dokuya Kujita, command Manewata Loblo, Kalegumata Hutter, Dota Hutter, Walanura, Kapavada, lucky return, sin the Wada, the sin of Presine, Ma, what a money, what that money, what a tapa, what a mimilla, what a papa party in a shoe.
It was the beginning of the end for the Khmer Rouge and for Pol Pot too. Sihanouk now negotiated a coalition with Sen, and the new combined government launched an offensive against the Khmer Rouge in western Cambodia, while the initial gains made by the government were pushed back by counter-offensives launched by Pot. In the course of 1994, the party was nevertheless witnessing increasing desertion of its forces in Cambodia in the months that followed. On its last legs, from this point onwards, it had little more than a few thousand troops occupying a small segment of the border region with Thailand. But despite its weakness, it would take until 1999 for the Cambodian government to fully defeat the party which had so...
Now, when it not call a letter that Robert Corner commanded that could turn a meal when it was learned about, but I was not going to let Papa party in a shoe. Papa party shoe on a commanded the he car on it, but there a level. Sin knocked the Hussein when my what I allowed a clown do what I thought two dog but door. But then I told her, how could I be tap up a noggle on the lure? Mimile Hussein or tap up that papa nola. The tap of my horror, but I tell Italian, Odila, Ila, the Walla, the Odila. To let the talk queer, queasy, queemano, Penimana, but Dola taught a pool of color Hussey party, Hussey a Padonino, but I let do what I want to do in it. But let do know what I'm up, but I let know where Mumu no normal. Pedro Tokuya, queasy queenumano.
terrorized its own country in the 1970s. However, Pol Pot would not live to see the final defeat of the Khmer Rouge. The man who had been born as Salat Tsar in the 1920s and who had created such immense human suffering in his homeland eventually met his end in 1998.
A party led the order of la Khmer Rouge when it Papa Duane, our attachua to the Tivala. More like Pedro Tokuya Kujicorner with the Ura Penila. More like Cola water, cancer that charm go on it all, or Tapuara with the Penila. Bazanaga de Tokuya Kujiquida, the Lawa Tilone, a party while as Chocho Majo, the Paro, when who say they were do a taller Tamanaga Penimono. I want the Tiva without sugar, mother.
But his downfall had come shortly before that, with the Khmer's fortunes at their lowest ebb ever. The husk of a party which remained turned against its leader in 1997. Paranoia and internal disputes plagued the leadership in the wilds of Western Cambodia by this time, and in a party coup in the summer of 1997, Pol Pot and his family were placed under house arrest by a rival faction, led by one Ta Mok. By that time, Pol Pot did not have long to live in any event. He suffered from a heart condition, and a stroke had left him partially paralyzed and needing regular oxygen. Moreover, his cancer remained, and without access to effective medical care, he was deteriorating rapidly. Such was the wreckage of a man whom the Khmer Rouge put on trial in July 1997, in a remarkably hypocritical act. He was sentenced to life in prison by the party which he had himself led for over 30 years. But that life would end shortly thereafter. On the 15th of April 1998, Pol Pot died in his sleep as his heart gave out, though suspicions have since arisen that he committed suicide to avoid being handed over to the United States for trial. On the
material dollar Pol Pot in Tilawa Pella touch my jaw all alone, but them let Takuta will lucky no that day order. Lekina when I get a common touch work like when a tema lewa pog a lot of a paga let that the Hipuda, Lekiloneta. Common a kewa parala, put a second in Matima, what I do to Togone, Quapari, the war crime, Lobama, Matora, then I go Hunida, Patella, the king at Thimo, at the one of what the Notella at Oxilo at the Goda, Lenny Miana, United States, or Hidala, Papana, Waglet, Tower, common and let that it up Hunida. I will buy a tower at Amutara, America, Cabao, Lecho, Wayanamana, Bazana Gida, to clear away. He told never know what the good mother David. kewe pargale komo edote pargale pora thom
21st of April 1998, 6 days after his death, he was cremated in a Buddhist ceremony. Thus died one of the 20th century's most brutal dictators. He left behind a country which today is littered with landmines, and a scarred history and a largely authoritarian state. There is no doubting that Pol Pot was one of the true monsters of the 20th century, a century in which such figures abounded throughout the world. But what perhaps marks Pol Pot out is the enormous brutality with which he and the Khmer Rouge carried out the Cambodian genocide between 1975 and 1979. During these years, the regime turned against everyone within its borders. Foreigners and political dissenters were targeted above others, as is usually the case with totalitarian societies. But Pot and his followers even turned entirely against their own people, murdering hundreds of thousands of Cambodians in mass labor camps, in a crazed pursuit of agricultural productivity, which only succeeded in creating a famine. As a result, Pol Pot's regime murdered and killed nearly 1 out of every 4 Cambodian citizens in less than half a decade during the late 1970s. It is hardly any surprise that, as a result, the United Nations and the Red Cross were already declaring by 1979 that Pol Pot and his regime were bringing about the near destruction of Cambodian society. Only the intervention of the Vietnamese that year stopped the crazed.
The potato dollar were pora ne power patonya minimal Vienna had not do without Cambodia governor, but chomola atama tima wanica, a daughter him, other terra, do common a couple of Vienna hella do without Cambodia, honey, or our hella do without but you knew have no atama tima war patella a policy did pane how with them no. Do patella gave what a party with us you just will thought gave it up what I the Cambodia couple of 20th century more
Horrific killing. That is Pol Pot's legacy. There is nothing approaching any rationalizations which can be made for it. What do you think of Pol Pot? Was he perhaps the most tyrannical dictator of the entire 20th century? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
The when they come on a teleport when they gave up what I got on my logo away. Paanya mong la ke por galo le tai te so le pa to por galo pora to na ke ne por gane sara le pa gi ki te le pa mo wa ta mu le ne come on por gane come on la kho ti ga de do ne ke ti ti pe ko to pe de ke lo we de cho le ki la ne ta ke lo ne tho mo no we na tho tu le ke ra ba khu na lo ne pa ke ta to mo we ne do ke we ta ma lo kha la pha gi nya mo por ga de we da ma lo we ke lo we ne ma lo wa do ne ti nya ta le pa to ne blood con head hog hair kera le pa gila ne ka te le pa to ya ne mo no do awen mi na ta ma lo kha le wa te ge ri do tho bo lo mo wen
This mistake is costing me